I decided to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia on my own. It was something I had been planning for a while, and I felt confident I could handle it. I had done plenty of day hikes before, but never something this long. I thought it would be good for me to get away from everything, clear my head. The first couple of days went fine. The trail was peaceful, and I barely saw anyone else. I had an old map with me that I thought would be good enough. But on the third day, something went wrong. I missed a turn or took the wrong path. I still don't know exactly how it happened. By the time I realized it, the trail looked different, unfamiliar. I tried to backtrack, but I couldn't find the last marker. Panic started to set in, but I told myself to stay calm. I had enough food and water for a couple of days. I kept walking, hoping to find a familiar spot, but everything just looked the same. Endless trees and brush. The sun was starting to go down, and I hadn't seen another person all day. That's when I heard voices. At first, I was relieved. I thought maybe I had stumbled across another group of hikers who could help me find my way back. I followed the sounds and soon saw them, 3 men standing around a fire they had made, laughing and talking loudly. I approached them, trying to sound casual. I asked if they knew the trail well and if they could help me find my way back. They looked at each other for a moment, then one of them, tall, with a scruffy beard, said they knew the area pretty well and could guide me back to the main trail. They seemed friendly enough, so I decided to trust them. I didn't have many options, anyway. We walked together for a while, and they chatted among themselves, but something felt off. They kept making jokes that I didn't understand, glancing at me in a way that made me uneasy. The trail was getting narrower, and the trees denser, blocking out the last bit of daylight. After about an hour, I noticed we were going deeper into the woods, not back toward the main trail. I asked them about it, but the tall guy just laughed and said it was a shortcut. The others laughed too, but it didn't feel right. The unease I had been feeling turned into real fear. I started lagging behind, hoping I could slip away without them noticing. But they kept looking back at me, making sure I was still there. I could tell they were up to something, and I knew I had to get away from them. We came to a small clearing, and I decided it was my chance. I pretended I needed to tie my boot, so I stopped and bent down, taking my time. They kept walking a few steps ahead, and when they were just far enough, I bolted in the opposite direction. I ran as fast as I could, not caring about the noise I was making or if I was getting more lost. I just needed to put distance between us. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I pushed through branches and underbrush, not looking back. Eventually, their voices faded, and I slowed down, trying to catch my breath. I had no idea where I was, but I kept moving. The forest was dark now, and I couldn't see much. I tripped over roots and rocks, scraping my hands and knees, but I kept going. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light in the distance. I headed toward it, hoping it was a campsite or something. As I got closer, I realized it was a ranger station, probably an emergency outpost. I stumbled up to the door and pounded on it, not sure if anyone would be there at this hour. To my relief, a ranger opened the door. I must have looked a mess, dirty, bloody, and terrified because he immediately asked what happened. I told him everything, as best as I could between gasps for air. He brought me inside, gave me some water, and radioed for help. He told me I was lucky I found the station because I was miles off the main trail. The men I ran into weren't hikers. They had been reported by other hikers earlier in the week, seen lurking around the trails. The ranger assured me I was safe now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, looking for me. When the rescue team arrived, they took me back to town, where I stayed for the night before heading home the next day. I haven't been hiking since, and I don't think I ever will again. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail, just a stretch in Tennessee. I've always loved being out there, away from everything, but this time was different. The air felt thick, like something was off. I noticed it early in the day, but I brushed it off as nerves. I was by myself, and sometimes your mind plays tricks when you're alone in the woods. It was getting late, and I needed to find a spot to camp. That's when I came across a campsite that looked like someone had just left in a hurry. The tent was still up, and there was food on a small stove. The pot was still hot, and steam was rising from it. I could smell whatever was cooking, some kind of stew. There was a backpack thrown to the side, half open with clothes spilling out. It looked like whoever was here left in a panic. I walked around the site, trying to see if anyone was nearby. There was no sign of them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. My stomach tightened as I noticed a trail of blood leading away from the campsite. It wasn't a lot, but enough to catch my eye. The droplets were fresh, dark against the dirt, and they led into the trees. I stood there, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to follow the trail, see if someone needed help. But another part of me, the smarter part, was telling me to turn around and get out of there. I should have listened to that part, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the blood trail into the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on the ground and the pounding of my heart in my ears. The trail wound deeper into the woods, and with every step, I felt like I was being pulled into something I didn't understand. Then I heard voices. They were faint at first, just whispers carried by the breeze. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were getting closer. I froze, listening. There were at least 2, maybe 3 people talking, but their tone was strange and calm, almost too calm given the situation. I crouched down behind a thick tree, trying to stay out of sight. The voices were clearer now, just on the other side of a small hill. They were talking about the blood, how it was leading them right to it. I didn't know what they meant, but the way they said it sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to turn back, but I was too scared to move. The voices got louder, and I could hear footsteps crunching through the leaves. They were getting closer, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I peered around the tree, just enough to see without being seen. There were 3 of them, all dressed in dark clothes. They were following the blood trail, moving slowly like they were hunting something. One of them had a knife, the blade catching the fading light. I don't know why, but I knew they weren't there to help anyone. They were looking for something, or someone, and I didn't want to find out what. I tried to move as quietly as I could, stepping back from the trail. My foot caught on a branch, and it snapped under my weight. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. The voices stopped, and I heard one of them say, "Did you hear that?" I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise anymore. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps pounding on the ground, but I didn't look back. I just ran. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept going. The forest was a blur of green and brown, and all I could think about was getting away. I stumbled onto another trail, one I recognized, and I knew I was close to the main path. I pushed myself harder, and finally, I burst out of the trees onto the main trail. I didn't stop running until I reached a small group of hikers setting up camp a few miles down. I must have looked like a madman, wild-eyed and gasping for breath. They asked what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain. I stayed with them that night, but I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about the abandoned campsite, the blood, and those voices. I don't know what they were looking for, and I don't want to know. The next morning, I left the trail and drove home, swearing I'd never go back. I decided to hike the Appalachian Trail through North Carolina by myself. I've done a lot of solo hikes before, but something about this one felt different from the start. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath. I set out early in the morning, the mist still hanging low over the trees. The first few miles were peaceful. The quiet was comforting, just the sound of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird calling from somewhere above. A few hours in, I saw him for the first time. He was ahead of me on the trail, just a silhouette against the trees. He was standing still, like he was waiting for something. As I got closer, he turned and walked off the trail into the woods. I didn't think much of it at the time. Lots of people hike the trail, and it's not unusual to see others. But something about the way he moved, so deliberately, stuck with me. I kept going, pushing the thought of him to the back of my mind. The trail was beautiful, winding through the forest with views that stretched out over the valleys. I lost myself in it, letting the rhythm of my steps carry me. But then I saw him again, about an hour later. This time, he was behind me. I didn't hear him approach, but when I looked back, he was there, just standing on the trail, watching me. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just another hiker. Maybe he was walking at a similar pace and we were just crossing paths. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I sped up, putting more distance between us, and eventually, I couldn't see him anymore. The day wore on, and I kept moving, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I stopped for a break at a small clearing, sitting down on a fallen log to catch my breath. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somewhere nearby. When I got back on the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him. And then, sure enough, there he was, further down the trail. This time, he was closer. I could see his face now, though it was partially hidden by the shadow of his hat. He wasn't smiling, just staring at me with this blank expression that made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do. Confronting him seemed like a bad idea, but so did ignoring it. I picked up my pace, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But every time I thought I'd lost him, he would show up again. Sometimes he was ahead of me, sometimes behind, but always just far enough away that I couldn't say for sure what he was doing. It was getting late, and I needed to find a place to set up camp for the night. I was exhausted, but the thought of stopping made my heart race. I didn't want to be out there alone with him somewhere nearby, but I didn't have much choice. I found a spot a little ways off the trail, hidden behind some thick bushes. I set up my tent as quickly as I could, my hands shaking the whole time. As night fell, the forest around me became a dark maze of shadows. Every little sound made me jump. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, twigs snapping underfoot, but when I peeked out of the tent, there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, but deep down, I knew better. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured him standing just outside my tent, waiting. When morning finally came, I packed up and got back on the trail as fast as I could. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he was probably just another hiker, but the fear wouldn't go away. As I walked, I kept seeing him. He was always there, just at the edge of my vision. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of him through the trees, his dark figure blending with the shadows. Other times, I would turn a corner, and he'd be standing right there, too close for comfort. But no matter what, he never approached me, never said a word. Just watched. I started to feel like I was being hunted. The trail that had once felt so peaceful now felt like a trap, leading me deeper into the woods with no way out. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I needed to get off the trail, I was miles from the nearest road, and there was no cell service out here. By the time the sun started to set, I was on the verge of panic. I hadn't seen him for a while, but I knew he was still out there, somewhere. I found a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to a road or at least a more populated area. But the further I went, the more lost I felt. It was almost dark when I stumbled upon an old, abandoned shelter. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was better than nothing. I decided to spend the night there, hoping I could make it out in the morning. The shelter was small, just enough room for me to lie down, with a rickety door that barely closed. I huddled inside, my back against the wall, staring at the door. Every creak, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart skip a beat. I kept expecting him to burst through the door, but the night passed in agonizing silence. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shelter, I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things and started walking, not caring where I ended up as long as it was away from there. I must have walked for hours, not stopping for anything. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop. Not until I was safe. Finally, I stumbled onto a dirt road. It wasn't much, but it was something. I followed it until I found a small gas station, the first sign of civilization I'd seen in days. I didn't tell the clerk about the man, I just asked for directions to the nearest town. I needed to get away from the trail, from those woods. As I sat in the back of a bus headed toward the nearest city, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. Maybe he was just another hiker. Maybe it was all in my head, but I couldn't forget his face, the way he always seemed to be just a little too close. I'd been planning it for months and finally found a weekend where I could get away. I'm not much of a solo hiker, so I was relieved when I met a small group of people at the trailhead who were going the same way. There were 3 of them, and they seemed friendly enough, so I asked if I could join them. They didn't mind, and we set off together. There was Sarah, a woman in her early 30s, talkative and upbeat. Her boyfriend, Tom, was more quiet but polite. The third guy, though, he was different. He didn't introduce himself or say anything, really. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and a look in his eyes that made me uneasy. He stayed at the back of the group, never talking, just watching. At first, I tried to make small talk with him, but he didn't respond. He just looked at me, his eyes cold and distant, before turning away. I figured he was just one of those people who prefer to keep to themselves, so I left it alone. We hiked through the morning, the trail winding through thick forests and up steep inclines. The scenery was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the day went on, the man's behavior got stranger. He kept hanging back, walking slower than the rest of us. At one point, I turned around, and he wasn't there. I didn't hear him coming, but when I looked again, he was just behind me, too close for comfort. It was like he was trying to sneak up on me, but when I confronted him, he just stared at me with that same blank expression. I mentioned it to Sarah and Tom, but they didn't seem concerned. They said they'd noticed he was quiet, but they hadn't thought much of it. They suggested he might just be shy or socially awkward, but I wasn't so sure. There was something in the way he looked at us, something that made my skin crawl. We stopped for lunch by a small stream. The sun was high in the sky, and the woods were quiet except for the sound of the water. The man didn't eat, he just sat a little way off, staring into the trees. I tried to ignore him and enjoy the break, but it was hard with him sitting there, watching us. After lunch, we continued on. The trail became more difficult, with steep climbs and rocky paths. The man kept lagging behind, but he was always there, just out of sight. I started to feel uneasy, like we were being followed, but it was just him. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but it kept creeping back in. As the day wore on, the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up. We decided to find a place to camp for the night. We found a clearing not far from the trail, surrounded by tall trees that would offer some protection from the wind. We set up our tents, and I kept an eye on the man. He didn't help, just stood there, watching us again. When night fell, we gathered around a small fire. Sarah and Tom tried to make conversation, but the man stayed silent, sitting just outside the circle of light. His eyes reflected the flames, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something. I kept my knife close, just in case. As we talked, I noticed the man's breathing was getting heavier. He was sitting there, staring at the fire, his chest rising and falling in a way that seemed unnatural. It was like he was struggling to control himself, like he was holding something back. I glanced at Sarah and Tom, but they didn't seem to notice. I decided to stay up and keep watch, just in case. The fire burned down to embers, and one by one, the others went to their tents. I sat by the dying fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. The man stayed where he was, not moving, just staring. The darkness closed in around us, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and walked over to him. I asked if he was okay, if something was wrong, but he didn't respond. He just looked up at me with those cold, empty eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I backed away, returning to my tent. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing noises outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Every time I peeked out of the tent, I saw him, standing just outside the camp, watching us. It was like he was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of something moving outside. It was still dark, the fire long dead. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer to the tents. I grabbed my knife, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, listening, waiting. Then, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then slowly unzipped the tent. The man was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. The forest was silent, too silent. I woke Sarah and Tom, telling them the man was gone. We quickly packed up our things, deciding to leave before he came back. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light through the trees. We hurried back to the trail, constantly looking over our shoulders. As we walked, we kept expecting him to appear, but he never did. The further we got from the campsite, the more the tension began to ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The trail felt different, more menacing somehow. When we finally reached the next trailhead, we didn't stop. We got in our cars and left without looking back. I don't know what happened to that man, or what he was planning, but I'm glad we got out of there when we did. The thought of him still haunts me, the way he watched us, the way he moved. I haven't been back on the trail since. The memory of that day is too fresh, too real. I still wonder who he was, what he wanted, but I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that something was wrong out there, something that I don't want to ever experience again. I had been hiking the Appalachian Trail in Maine for a few days. The weather was perfect, and I hadn't seen many people, which was nice. I liked the solitude, the quiet of the forest, and the rhythm of my footsteps on the trail. I was about halfway through my planned hike when I met the man. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows. I was just about to stop and check my map when I saw him coming up the trail toward me. He was wearing what looked like a park ranger's uniform, but it seemed a bit off. The shirt was wrinkled, and the patches were faded, like it had been washed too many times. His boots were muddy and worn, but that wasn't unusual. What struck me was how his eyes looked. They were dark, almost too dark, and he didn't smile. "Hey there," he said, his voice calm but somehow unsettling. "You shouldn't be out here alone. There's been reports of some dangerous wildlife in the area." I stopped, unsure of what to do. He seemed official enough, but something wasn't right. He hadn't introduced himself or asked if I needed help. He just started talking like he knew where I was going. I told him I was fine, that I was planning to camp a few miles up the trail, but he shook his head. "It's not safe up there," he insisted. "There's a better spot not far from here. I can show you." His eyes didn't leave mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I had been on enough hikes to know that park rangers usually didn't behave this way. They were friendly, helpful, and didn't just appear out of nowhere like this. I hesitated, trying to think of an excuse to keep going, but he took a step closer. "Come on," he said, his voice a little sharper now. "I'm just trying to help you." I nodded, not wanting to anger him, but I kept my distance. He turned and started walking back down the trail, motioning for me to follow. I did, but something in my gut told me this was a mistake. The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows in the woods were growing longer. I kept glancing around, looking for any sign of another person, but we were alone. He led me off the main trail onto a narrow, overgrown path. The trees here were thick, blocking out most of the remaining light. I tried to make conversation, to ask him about his job, but he gave vague answers, never looking back at me. I noticed he didn't have a radio or any other equipment a ranger would normally carry. My heart started to race, but I didn't know what to do. If I ran, would he chase me? We walked for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 20 minutes. The path wound deeper into the woods, and I was completely turned around. I had no idea where we were or how to get back. Finally, we reached a small clearing. It was barely big enough for a tent, and the ground was uneven and covered in rocks. He stopped and turned to me. "This is it," he said, his voice flat. "You'll be safe here." I looked around, my fear growing. There was no sign of a campsite, no sign that anyone had ever been here before. I knew then that he wasn't who he claimed to be. I forced a smile and thanked him, hoping he would leave, but he just stood there, watching me. "You should set up your tent before it gets dark," he said, his tone almost commanding. I nodded again, my hands trembling as I reached into my pack. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. I didn't want to turn my back on him, but I couldn't just stand there. As I fumbled with my gear, I saw him take a step closer, and I panicked. "Actually," I blurted out, "I think I'll just head back to the main trail. I'm sure I'll be fine." His expression changed then, something dark flickering across his face. "I told you it's not safe," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You need to stay here." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He took another step toward me, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let him get any closer. I dropped my pack and turned to run, but he grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "Where do you think you're going?" he hissed, pulling me back. I struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. My mind was screaming at me to fight, to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear. He pulled me closer, his breath hot on my face, and I could see the malice in his eyes. Then, out of nowhere, there was a noise in the woods behind us. A rustling of leaves, followed by the snap of a twig. He froze, his grip loosening just enough for me to wrench my arm free. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran, not caring which direction I was going, just needing to get away. I heard him curse and start after me, but I didn't look back. The trees blurred around me as I crashed through the undergrowth, my heart pounding in my ears. I tripped over roots and stumbled through bushes, but I kept going, driven by pure terror. After what felt like forever, I burst out onto the main trail, nearly collapsing in relief. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, and spotted a group of hikers in the distance. I ran toward them, shouting for help. They turned, confused at first, but then they saw the fear on my face. I reached them just as the man emerged from the woods behind me. He stopped when he saw the group, his expression darkening. For a moment, I thought he might try to grab me again, but then he just turned and walked back into the trees without a word. The hikers were kind, though they didn't understand what had happened. I was too shaken to explain it properly. They stayed with me until we reached the next trailhead, where I reported the man to the authorities. They searched the area, but they never found him. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail in Vermont when the storm hit. It came out of nowhere, dark clouds rolling in fast, the wind picking up. I didn't have time to find proper shelter, so when I saw a cabin just off the trail, I didn't hesitate. The place looked old, like it hadn't been used in years, but it was better than being out in the storm. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside, shaking off the rain. The first thing that hit me was the smell, musty and damp, like the place hadn't been aired out in a long time. The inside was dark, the windows grimy and barely letting in any light. I pulled on my flashlight and started looking around. The cabin was small, just one room with a broken down bed in the corner, a table with one leg propped up by a stack of old books, and a stone fireplace. There was something unsettling about the place, but I figured it was just the storm and my nerves getting to me. I was soaking wet, so I decided to start a fire. There was a pile of wood next to the fireplace, dry enough to burn. As I was setting up, I noticed something strange. The wood was cut into neat, even pieces, not what you'd expect from a place that looked abandoned. It was almost like someone had been there recently. I shook off the feeling and focused on getting warm. Once the fire was going, I felt a little better. I took off my wet clothes, hanging them near the fire to dry, and sat down at the table to eat something. That's when I noticed the first trap. It was a thin wire, almost invisible in the dim light, stretched across the floor just behind the chair I was about to sit in. I froze, my heart pounding. If I had pulled that chair out, I might have triggered it. I didn't know what it was connected to, but I wasn't about to find out. I carefully backed away, shining my flashlight around the room. That's when I saw more of them. There were wires all over the place, some attached to the door, others near the windows, and a few on the floor, hidden among the dust and debris. Whoever set them knew what they were doing. It wasn't just random traps, they were carefully placed, designed to catch someone off guard. I needed to get out of there, but I had to be careful. I moved slowly, trying to remember where each wire was. My heart was racing, and every little noise made me jump. The storm outside was raging, but the inside of the cabin was dead silent, except for the creaking of the old wood under my feet. I was almost to the door when I heard it, a low, rumbling noise, like a car engine. My blood ran cold. Someone was coming. I had to move faster. I reached the door and was about to open it when I noticed another wire, this one attached to the doorknob. I cursed under my breath, pulling my hand back just in time. The rumbling got louder, and I knew whoever was coming was close. I had to find another way out. I looked around, desperate. There was a small window near the bed, just big enough to squeeze through. I carefully made my way over, avoiding the traps as best I could. I was almost there when I heard the car stop right outside the cabin. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed my clothes from near the fire and pulled them on, even though they were still damp. I reached the window, but it was stuck. I pushed harder, trying not to make too much noise, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. Someone was right outside the door. Panic set in. I grabbed a piece of firewood and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered, but it was loud, too loud. I heard the doorknob turn, and I knew I had only seconds to get out. I climbed through the window, cutting my hands on the broken glass, but I didn't care. I was halfway out when I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't look back. I just pushed myself the rest of the way through and hit the ground outside hard. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring about the rain or the darkness. The storm was still raging, but I could barely hear it over the sound of my own breathing. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from that cabin. I didn't stop running until I was back on the main trail, my legs burning and my lungs on fire. I looked back once, but the cabin was out of sight, hidden by the trees and the storm. I kept moving, even though I was exhausted, not daring to stop until I was sure I was far enough away. Eventually, I found a small clearing and collapsed against a tree, trying to catch my breath. I listened, but all I could hear was the rain and the wind. Whoever had been in that cabin, they hadn't followed me. Not yet, anyway. I spent the rest of the night huddled under a tree, too scared to sleep. When the storm finally passed and the sun started to rise, I got up and started walking again. I didn't stop until I reached a ranger station, miles away from that cabin. I told the rangers what had happened, but I don't know if they ever found the place. I didn't go back to check, and I never planned to. I don't know who set those traps or what they were planning to do if they found me, but I'm not sticking around to find out. All I know is, if you're ever hiking the Appalachian Trail and you see a cabin off the path, just keep walking. Don't go inside. No matter how bad the storm gets, it's not worth the risk. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail in New Hampshire, just enjoying the solitude and the fresh air. It was one of those crisp autumn days where the leaves were changing colors, and the trail was quiet. I'd been out there for a few days, mostly keeping to myself, just trying to clear my head. Around midday, I crossed paths with a man. He looked like a regular hiker, a bit older than me, probably in his late 40s, with a beard and a worn-out backpack. He seemed a little flustered, though. He said he was looking for his friend, who had wandered off the trail earlier that morning. He seemed genuinely worried, so I asked if he needed help. He seemed relieved when I offered, almost too relieved. But I didn't think much of it at the time. We started walking together, him leading the way. He said his friend, a guy named Tom, was supposed to meet him at a certain point on the trail, but never showed up. He pointed out a few places where he thought Tom might have gone off to explore, but there was no sign of anyone. As we walked, I tried to ask him more about Tom, like what he looked like or what kind of gear he had with him. The man's answers were vague, though. He said Tom was about his height, wearing a similar outfit, and had a blue backpack. But when I pressed for more details, like if Tom had a map or a compass, the man's answers didn't add up. He just kept saying things like, I think he might have had a map, or he should have known better than to wander off. The more we walked, the more uneasy I started to feel. The trail was getting narrower, the trees thicker, and the sunlight dimmer. I wasn't familiar with this part of the trail, and it felt like we were going off the main path. I mentioned this to the man, but he just brushed it off, saying Tom was probably just a bit deeper into the woods and we'd find him soon. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen any other hikers for a while. That's when I started to feel really uneasy. The man was still leading the way, but something about his demeanor had changed. He wasn't looking around as much, like he wasn't really searching for anyone anymore. His pace had slowed down too, like he was in no rush to find his so-called friend. I decided to try to turn the conversation back to Tom, hoping to get more information or maybe trip him up. I asked if Tom had any family waiting for him back home. The man paused for a moment, then said something like, "No, Tom's pretty much on his own. Just like me." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. That's when it hit me. What if there was no Tom? What if this guy was just leading me deeper into the woods for some other reason? My mind started racing, thinking about all the stories you hear, about people disappearing on the trail, never to be found again. I needed to get out of there. But I couldn't just bolt. We were too deep into the woods, and if he was up to something, running would only make things worse. So, I started slowing down, pretending like I was getting tired, hoping he'd keep going ahead of me. He noticed, of course, and stopped, turning to look at me. "You all right?" he asked, his voice flat. I forced a smile and said I just needed to catch my breath. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. I could see him thinking, trying to decide what to do next. I told him maybe we should split up, cover more ground that way. I'd go back to the main trail and ask other hikers if they'd seen Tom, while he kept searching in the woods. But he shook his head and said it was better to stick together, that it was too easy to get lost out here alone. The way he said it made my skin crawl. At that point, I knew I had to get away from him. I needed a plan. I glanced around, trying to remember the way we'd come, but everything looked the same. I decided to play along a bit longer, acting like I was still on board with finding this imaginary friend. I started suggesting that maybe Tom had gone back to the main trail, trying to convince the man to head back with me. We walked a little further, and then I saw my chance. The trail split, with one path looking more worn and the other leading into even thicker woods. I told him I thought I saw a footprint on the worn path and suggested we check it out. He hesitated, glancing between me and the path into the deeper woods. For a moment, I thought he was going to insist on going the other way. But then he nodded, and we started back toward the main trail. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm, keep up the act. As we walked, I subtly picked up the pace, trying to get a little distance between us. He didn't seem to notice at first, too busy looking around, pretending to search for someone who didn't exist. Then I saw it, a break in the trees where the sunlight was shining through, indicating we were close to the main trail again. I quickened my pace, almost to the point of jogging, and that's when I heard him behind me, picking up speed too. I didn't wait. I broke into a full run, darting through the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear him running after me, his footsteps heavy on the ground. I didn't look back, just focused on the light ahead, on getting to safety. I burst through the trees onto the main trail, almost crashing into a group of hikers coming the other way. I must have looked like a crazy person, panting and wide-eyed, but I didn't care. I quickly explained that there was a man in the woods who had been leading me away from the trail, claiming he was looking for a friend. The hikers were a group of 3 men, and they immediately took me seriously. 2 of them stayed with me while the third, the biggest of them, headed back into the woods to see if he could find the man. He never found him, but the group got me back to safety. I managed to get their names, so thanks to Jed, Ryan, and Baker I ended up safe that day. To them I will always be grateful. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia, taking in the fresh air and enjoying the quiet. It was early afternoon, and I was making good progress. The trail was pretty empty, just the occasional bird call breaking the silence. I liked it that way, no distractions, just me and the trail. I'd been walking for a few hours when I saw another hiker up ahead. He was sitting on a rock by the side of the trail, holding his ankle like he was hurt. As I got closer, he looked up at me, and I could see he was sweating, his face pale. He waved at me, calling out for help. I walked over, asking if he was okay. He said he'd twisted his ankle badly and couldn't walk on it. He looked like he was in real pain, grimacing every time he moved. I asked if he needed help getting back to the nearest shelter or if he had a phone to call someone, but he said he didn't have any signal. I looked around. We were pretty deep in the woods, and it didn't seem like anyone else was nearby. I told him I could help him walk if he leaned on me. He nodded, looking grateful, and I helped him up. He put his arm around my shoulders, and we started moving slowly down the trail. At first, everything seemed fine. He was limping heavily, putting most of his weight on me. I could feel him struggling to keep up, but we were making progress. I kept talking to him, trying to keep his spirits up, asking where he was from, stuff like that. He said he was from out of state, just passing through, doing a solo hike. But after a few minutes, something started to feel off. His grip on my shoulder was tightening, like too tight, almost hurting me. I glanced at him, and he wasn't grimacing anymore. In fact, he wasn't making any sound at all, just staring straight ahead, his face expressionless. I tried to pull away a bit, saying maybe we should stop and take a break, but he didn't let go. His grip tightened even more, and suddenly, he jerked me to the side, pulling me off the trail into the woods. I stumbled, trying to regain my balance, but he was strong, much stronger than I expected. Before I knew it, I was on the ground, and he was on top of me, pinning me down. I tried to push him off, but he was heavy, and his hands were around my throat before I could react. I was choking, gasping for air, and his face was inches from mine, still with that same blank expression. I don't know where the strength came from, but I managed to get one of my arms free and punched him in the side of the head as hard as I could. He grunted and loosened his grip just enough for me to roll out from under him. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding, and backed away, trying to catch my breath. He was slower to get up, rubbing the side of his head where I'd hit him, but the look in his eyes had changed. Now there was something there, something dark, almost like anger, but colder. He didn't say a word, just started coming toward me again, slowly, like he knew he had all the time in the world. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, not even caring if I stayed on the trail. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps getting closer. I was panicking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, branches whipping against my face and arms as I tore through the underbrush. I spotted a thick cluster of trees up ahead and dove into it, crouching down, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was shaking, trying to stay quiet, listening for any sign of him. For a few moments, all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, I heard him. He was close, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like he was hunting me. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. I could see him through the gaps in the trees, moving carefully, his head turning side to side, scanning the area. He was only a few feet away from where I was hiding. I don't know how long I stayed there, but it felt like an eternity. Eventually, his footsteps started to fade, and I dared to peek out. He was walking back toward the trail, still looking around, but he seemed less certain now, like he'd lost track of me. I waited until he was out of sight, then slowly, carefully, started making my way in the opposite direction, keeping low to the ground, moving as quietly as I could. I was terrified he'd hear me, but I knew I had to get as far away from him as possible. After what felt like hours, I finally found the trail again, but I didn't stop. I kept moving, my eyes darting around, expecting him to jump out at me at any moment. I didn't slow down until I saw other hikers up ahead, a small group taking a break by the side of the trail. I stumbled toward them, my legs barely holding me up. They must have seen the look on my face because they immediately asked if I was okay. I tried to explain what had happened, but I was so out of breath and scared that my words were coming out in a jumble. One of the hikers, a woman, took charge, telling me to sit down and breathe. Another guy pulled out his phone to call for help, while the others kept looking around, making sure the guy who attacked me wasn't anywhere nearby. It took a while, but eventually, help arrived. A park ranger showed up, and I told him everything. He took it seriously, which I was grateful for, but I could see the worry on his face as he listened. He said they'd search the area, but I could tell he didn't think they'd find the guy. They didn't, as far as I know. I was escorted back to a ranger station, where they took my statement and made sure I was okay before I was allowed to leave. The whole thing felt surreal, like it hadn't really happened, but the bruises on my neck told me otherwise. I didn't go back to finish the trail. I couldn't bring myself to return after that. The thought of being out there again, alone, where he could be lurking, was too much. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania, taking my time and enjoying the scenery. The weather was nice, not too hot, and the trail wasn't crowded, which was how I liked it. I've done a few solo hikes before, and this one felt just like the others, peaceful and quiet, with nothing but the sounds of nature around me. I noticed another hiker a little ways ahead of me. He was moving slowly, almost like he was waiting for me to catch up. I didn't think much of it at first, just figured he was taking his time, maybe enjoying the trail like I was. When I got closer, he glanced back at me and then sped up a bit, staying just out of reach. I tried not to let it bother me, but something about the way he kept looking over his shoulder made me uneasy. It was like he was keeping track of where I was, making sure I didn't get too close. I slowed down, giving him some space, but he did the same, staying at that same distance. After a while, I stopped to take a break, sitting on a large rock off the side of the trail. The guy kept going, disappearing around a bend. I figured that would be the last I'd see of him, but after I started walking again, it wasn't long before I spotted him up ahead. He was sitting on a fallen log, messing with something in his backpack. As I walked past, I glanced at him, giving a small nod, just being polite. He didn't nod back, just stared at me for a moment before looking down at whatever he was doing. I felt his eyes on me as I walked by, and it made my skin crawl. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A little further down the trail, I felt this odd sensation, like I was being watched. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anyone. The woods were thick, though, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept walking, trying to brush it off as just nerves, but that feeling stayed with me. After another mile or so, I stopped again to take a sip of water. That's when I saw him, just a quick flash of movement behind some trees off the trail. It was the guy from earlier, crouched down like he was trying to stay hidden. My heart started pounding. Why was he following me? I decided to confront him. I walked back down the trail, trying to keep my cool, but inside I was getting more and more anxious. When I got closer to where I'd seen him, I called out, asking what he was doing. At first, there was no response, just silence. Then, he stepped out from behind the trees, his face expressionless. I asked him again what he was doing, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just stood there, watching me. Then, he mumbled something about checking the trail map, but his voice was off, shaky. I didn't believe him. My eyes went to the backpack slung over his shoulder, and I noticed something sticking out of one of the pockets, a small camera. My stomach dropped. Had he been recording me? I asked him straight out if he was filming me, but he just stared at me, not saying anything. I repeated the question, louder this time, but that's when his expression changed. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step toward me, his hands clenching into fists. I started backing up, realizing too late how isolated we were. There was no one else around, just me and this guy in the middle of the woods. I demanded to know if he had been recording me, but instead of answering, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react, turning and running as fast as I could back down the trail. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, his footsteps getting closer. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest, but I didn't stop. I just kept running, my legs burning, breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, I spotted another hiker up ahead, a man with a large backpack, walking in the opposite direction. I screamed for help, waving my arms, and he turned just as I reached him. I pointed behind me, trying to explain what had happened, but before I could say much, the guy chasing me came into view. The hiker stepped in front of me, blocking the path. The guy following me stopped, his face twisted with anger, but he didn't say anything. The two of them stared each other down for what felt like forever. Then, without a word, the guy turned and walked back the way he'd come, disappearing into the trees. I was shaking so badly I could hardly stand. The hiker stayed with me, asking if I was okay and offering to walk me back to the nearest trailhead. I agreed, not wanting to be alone. We kept a fast pace, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, terrified that the guy might come back. When we finally reached the trailhead, there were more people around, families, other hikers getting ready to head out. I felt a wave of relief, but the fear didn't completely go away. I thanked the hiker who had helped me, but I was still too shaken to really express how grateful I was. I reported what had happened to a park ranger, describing the guy and what he'd done. The ranger took me seriously, promising to keep an eye out and to warn others on the trail. But as I left, I couldn't help feeling like the guy was still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching and waiting for his next opportunity. I haven't gone hiking alone since then. We had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 3 days, a group of 5 friends out for an adventure. It was late October, and the woods were a mix of orange, red, and brown, with a chill in the air. The nights were cold, but we were prepared. We had set up camp at a spot off the trail, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in on us as the night went on. We were exhausted from the day's hike, so after a quick meal, we all turned in early. The sounds of the forest at night were comforting: crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. I fell asleep quickly, buried deep in my sleeping bag, the warmth lulling me into a deep sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark. The air was colder than before, biting at my face. I reached out of my tent, expecting to hear the usual sounds of my friends moving around, but there was nothing. No voices, no shuffling, just silence. A heavy, unsettling silence. I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The fire we had built was nothing but cold ashes, and the other tents were closed, just as we had left them the night before. I called out softly, "Guys," but there was no response. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness, and it made me nervous. I walked over to the closest tent and unzipped it, expecting to see my friend Mike still asleep. But it was empty, the sleeping bag and gear untouched. I checked the next tent and then the next, each one empty, all of their belongings left behind. It was like they had just vanished in the middle of the night. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't right. I couldn't understand why they would leave without their gear, without waking me up. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I kept thinking, maybe they went to get water, or maybe they're playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I decided to check the area, thinking maybe they were nearby. I walked around the campsite, calling their names louder this time, but there was still no answer. The woods seemed darker than they should have been, and I realized the sun should have been coming up by now. But the sky was just a dull gray, like the light was struggling to break through. As I moved further from the camp, I started to feel like I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I found a trail of footprints leading away from the camp, but they weren't clear, like they had been partially washed away by the morning dew. They didn't look like they belonged to any of my friends, too large, too deep. I hesitated, wondering if I should follow them. But what choice did I have? I couldn't just stay there alone. I started following the footprints, my heart pounding in my chest. The deeper I went into the woods, the more disoriented I felt. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't tell which way I was going anymore. The trail seemed to twist and turn on itself, leading me in circles. The sky above remained that same eerie gray, never brightening, never giving me a sense of time. The footprints led to a clearing I didn't recognize. It was open, with a thick fog that clung to the ground. In the center of the clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a pile of clothes, our clothes, the same ones my friends had been wearing the night before. They were laid out neatly, like they had been placed there on purpose. I backed away, my mind racing with fear. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a prank. Something was very, very wrong. I turned to leave, to run back to the camp, but I froze when I heard a sound behind me. It was a soft rustling, like someone or something was moving just out of sight. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct in my body told me to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. The rustling grew louder, closer. I finally forced myself to turn, expecting the worst, but there was nothing there. Just the fog in the trees, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I couldn't stay there any longer. I bolted, running back towards the camp as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care about the noise I was making, I just wanted to get away from whatever was out there. But the woods seemed to stretch on forever, no matter how far I ran. When I finally made it back to the camp, it was just as I had left it, empty, quiet, wrong. I grabbed my pack and started throwing my things together, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip up my bag. I had to get out of there, back to the main trail, back to safety. As I slung my pack over my shoulder, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were clear, deliberate, getting closer. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran, not caring which direction I was going, just away from the camp, away from those footsteps. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. I was gasping for breath, my lungs burning, but I didn't dare stop for long. I could still hear the footsteps, always just behind me, no matter how far I ran. It was like they were following me, taunting me, knowing I couldn't escape. I don't know how long I ran, or how far I went, but eventually, I stumbled onto the main trail. Relief flooded over me, but it was short-lived. The trail was empty, no sign of other hikers, no sign of my friends. I didn't know what to do, where to go. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of trail disappearing into the fog. I started walking, hoping to find help, find someone who could tell me what was going on. But the further I went, the more the trail seemed to blur into the trees, the fog closing in around me. My head was spinning, my thoughts jumbled. I just needed to get out, get back to civilization, but the trail didn't seem to lead anywhere. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a figure up ahead. My heart leaped with hope, thinking it might be one of my friends. I called out, but the figure didn't respond. They just stood there, motionless, waiting. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't one of my friends. It was tall, too tall, and its face was hidden in the shadow of a hood. I stopped, fear gripping me once again. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, and the figure took a step forward. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back, I couldn't. I just ran, faster than I ever had before. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I don't know how I made it out, but eventually, I found myself at the edge of the woods, the fog thinning out, the sky finally starting to lighten. I collapsed onto the side of the road, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I waited there for what felt like forever until a car finally came by. The driver stopped, concerned, and offered to take me to the nearest town. I didn't say much, just nodded and got in, my mind still reeling from what had happened. I never went back to the trail, never found out what happened to my friends. They were reported missing, and a search was conducted, but nothing was ever found, no signs of struggle, no bodies, nothing. It was like they had just vanished into thin air, leaving me with only the memory of that terrible, silent night in the woods. I'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail for a couple of days when I met this guy. He seemed normal enough, a little older, maybe in his late 40s, with a rough beard and a heavy pack. We chatted for a bit about the trail, weather, the usual stuff. He said his name was Gary. I remember thinking how friendly he was, the kind of guy who's done this a million times and knows all the tricks. We walked together for a while, and he started telling me about this shortcut. He said it would shave off a couple of miles and take me through some really scenic spots most hikers never see. It sounded great. I wasn't in a hurry, but I liked the idea of seeing something different, something off the beaten path. So, I agreed. The trail started off normal. It was a bit narrower than the main path, but nothing unusual. The trees were thicker, the ground was a little rougher, but I was used to that. Gary was ahead of me, moving fast for a guy with a heavy pack. I had to pick up my pace to keep up, but I didn't mind. It was nice having someone to talk to after a couple of days of being alone. After about an hour, things started to change. The path became less clear. The trees grew closer together, and the underbrush was thicker. I noticed there weren't any of the usual markers, no blazes on the trees, nothing to indicate we were still on a trail. I mentioned this to Gary, and he just laughed, said this part of the trail was more of a local secret, not maintained like the rest. That's when I started to feel uneasy. The air was different here, heavier somehow. The sounds of the forest seemed muted, like everything was holding its breath. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that Gary knew what he was doing. But the further we went, the more I started to doubt that. I tried to keep up with him, but he was moving faster, almost like he was trying to get away from me. I called out to him, asked him to slow down, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking, his back to me, not even turning around. I started to get a bad feeling, like something was off, but I didn't want to panic. Another hour passed, and the trail was gone completely. We were just walking through the woods now, no path in sight. Gary was still ahead, but he was almost out of view. I shouted his name, told him to wait up, but he ignored me. That's when I realized I hadn't seen his face in a while, hadn't really looked at him since we started this shortcut. I stopped walking. My heart was pounding, and my legs felt like lead. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see the main trail anymore, couldn't even hear the sounds of other hikers. It was like we were the only ones out there, completely isolated. I shouted again, louder this time, but Gary just kept moving, disappearing into the trees. Panic started to set in. I turned around, trying to find the way back, but everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, the ground, they all blended together. I couldn't tell which way we had come from, and there were no footprints to follow. It was like the forest had swallowed up the path behind us. I started running, hoping to find some sign of the trail, but every direction looked the same. The trees were closing in, and the light was fading fast. I was completely lost. I kept calling out for Gary, but there was no answer. It was like he had vanished into thin air. As the sun began to set, the forest grew darker, the shadows stretching out like fingers, grabbing at me. I could hear noises now, strange rustling in the bushes, the snap of twigs, but I couldn't see anything. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. I stumbled upon a clearing, thinking maybe I'd find some sign of Gary or the trail, but it was empty. Just a patch of dead grass and a circle of rocks, like someone had been there before but left a long time ago. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the silence was deafening. I stood there, my heart racing, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about just staying put, hoping someone would find me, but the idea of staying in that clearing, surrounded by those trees, was too much. I decided to keep moving, keep trying to find the trail, even though I had no idea where I was going. The darkness came quickly, and soon I was stumbling through the woods in pitch black. I didn't have a flashlight, just the faint glow of my phone, which was almost dead. Every sound made me jump, every shadow looked like something was lurking just out of sight. Hours passed, and I was getting desperate. My phone died, and I was left in complete darkness. I could hear something behind me, footsteps maybe, but when I turned around, there was nothing. I started to run, even though I couldn't see where I was going, just trying to get away from whatever was out there. I tripped over something, a root or a rock, and fell hard to the ground. I stayed there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to listen. That's when I heard it, a voice, faint, coming from somewhere in the trees. It was calling my name. I froze. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if it was Gary, if he had somehow circled back and found me. But the voice didn't sound right. It was distorted, like it was coming from far away, but still too close. I didn't respond, just stayed there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice called my name again, closer this time, but still wrong. It was too low, too drawn out, like someone was trying to mimic my name but didn't quite know how. I knew then that it wasn't Gary. It wasn't anyone I knew. It wasn't anyone at all. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care if I was going deeper into the woods. I just needed to get away from that voice, away from whatever was out there. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I burst out of the trees and onto a road. I don't know how I found it, don't know how long I had been running. But I was out of those woods, out of that nightmare. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, my heart still racing. A car came by not long after, the driver stopping when he saw me on the side of the road. I couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't find the words. I just asked him to take me to the nearest town, away from that place, away from those trees. I never saw Gary again, never went back to that trail. I don't know what I encountered out there, don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never take a shortcut again. It was peaceful, just me and the trees, the sounds of nature all around. I was getting close to the Virginia border when I decided to set up camp for the night. The spot I found was a little off the main trail, a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. It was perfect, or so I thought. As I was setting up my tent, I heard voices in the distance. I paused, listening. It was unusual to hear anyone this late. The sun had already set, and most hikers would have settled in for the night. The voices grew louder, and soon I could see them, a group of 3 men, all carrying heavy packs, coming towards me. They seemed friendly enough at first. They were smiling, and one of them waved as they approached. They said they were lost, had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and asked if they could camp near me for the night. I hesitated. Something about them made me uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude or seem paranoid. I was out here alone, and they hadn't done anything wrong yet. I nodded and said it was fine, pointing to a spot a little ways away from my tent. They thanked me and started setting up their own camp. As they worked, they kept glancing over at me, talking in low voices. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being silly. But as the night went on, the unease grew. They finished setting up their tent and made a small fire. I joined them, figuring it would be better to keep an eye on them than to sit alone in my tent. They offered me some food, but I wasn't hungry. I just sat there, trying to make small talk, but they weren't interested in talking. They just kept watching me. After a while, one of them, the one who had done most of the talking, asked me where I was headed. I told him, but kept it vague. He nodded, but didn't say anything else. The conversation died after that. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was getting late, and I was tired, but I didn't want to go back to my tent. I didn't want to turn my back on them. But I couldn't just sit there all night. Eventually, I stood up and said I was going to bed. They just nodded, watching me as I walked away. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, my heart pounding. I tried to calm down, telling myself I was safe, that I was just overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay there in the dark, listening. I could hear them talking again, but I couldn't make out the words. Then, one of them laughed, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping they would just go to sleep and leave me alone. Time passed, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Then, I heard footsteps outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but not quiet enough. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just lay there, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. Then, the zipper on my tent started to move, slowly, quietly. I froze, my mind screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't. I was too scared. The zipper stopped halfway down, and I saw a hand slip inside, pulling the flap open. I could see one of the men crouched outside, his face just a shadow in the dark. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, his eyes gleaming in the faint light from their dying fire. I don't know how long we stayed like that, just staring at each other. It felt like forever. Then, he grinned, a slow, creepy grin that made my skin crawl. He started to crawl into my tent, but something inside me snapped. I kicked out with all my strength, hitting him square in the chest. He fell back, cursing, and I scrambled out of the tent, grabbing my pack as I ran. I didn't stop to see what the others were doing. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran through the woods, branches scratching in my face and arms, until I couldn't hear them anymore. Eventually, I found the main trail and kept running until I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, my body shaking. I listened for any sign of him, but there was nothing, just the sound of the wind in the trees. I don't know how long I sat there, too scared to move, too scared to go back. When the sun finally started to rise, I forced myself to stand and started walking, my legs shaky and weak. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I called the police. They never found the men. They searched the area but didn't find any trace of them. I never went back to that part of the trail. I still hike, but I'm more careful now. I was about 3 days into my hike on the Appalachian Trail when I found the backpack. It was just lying there on the side of the trail, half covered by leaves like someone had dropped it and never looked back. The thing looked pretty beat up, and there was no one around, so I figured it had been there for a while. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped the main compartment and found some clothes, a few granola bars, and at the bottom, a journal. The journal was weathered, its pages a little crinkled from moisture, but the writing was still legible. It didn't seem right to just leave it there, so I sat down on a rock and started flipping through it. The first few entries were pretty standard, just a hiker recording his progress, talking about the beautiful views, the weather, and how freeing it was to be out there. But as I kept reading, the tone changed. He started writing about feeling watched. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, being out in the woods alone. But then he began noticing things, branches snapping nearby when there shouldn't have been anyone around, distant footsteps that seemed to follow him, even at night. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling only grew stronger. One entry stood out more than the others. He wrote that he had seen someone, a man, in the distance. The man didn't have a pack or any gear, just stood there in the woods, staring at him. He waved, but the man didn't move, didn't respond. Just stared. The hiker tried to convince himself it was nothing, maybe just another hiker taking a break, but the way he described it, you could tell he was scared. As I read further, it got worse. He started finding signs that someone was following him, footprints in the mud behind his own, fresh ones. His food went missing one night, even though he was sure he'd hung it up high enough to keep it out of reach of animals. He wrote about waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone breathing just outside his tent, but when he worked up the courage to check, there was no one there. The last few entries were almost frantic. He was moving faster, trying to cover more ground each day, but he was exhausted. He kept writing about the man, how he would see him in the distance, always keeping just far enough away that he couldn't get a good look at him. He tried calling out a few times, asking if the man needed help or if he was lost, but the man never answered. Just stared. The very last entry was short, just a few sentences scrawled across the page, the handwriting shaky. It said, "He's getting closer. I don't know what he wants. I can't sleep. I keep hearing him outside my tent. If anyone finds this, Please tell my family I love them. I closed the journal, my heart pounding. The air around me felt suddenly heavy, the forest too quiet. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was no one, just the trees and the endless stretch of trail. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, just like the guy in the journal. I stuffed the journal back into the backpack and stood up, deciding to move on. But as I started walking, I couldn't stop thinking about the guy's last words. What happened to him? Did he just disappear out here? I tried to tell myself it was just a story, something he made up to mess with whoever found the journal, but it didn't feel like that. It felt real. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The trail felt different now, more sinister. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump, every snap of a twig had my heart racing. I tried to push the thoughts away, focus on getting to the next shelter, but it was like the fear was clinging to me, wrapping itself around my mind. By the time I made it to the shelter, it was getting dark. There were a couple of other hikers there, setting up camp, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Being around other people made me feel safer, like whatever was out there couldn't get me if I wasn't alone. I tried to make small talk with the other hikers, but I must have seemed off because they kept their distance. I didn't mention the journal. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside had me on edge, and I kept imagining I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the shelter. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was worked up from reading that damn journal. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going to be able to relax until I got off the trail. The next morning, I packed up early and started hiking again. The sky was overcast, and the forest felt darker, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me, just out of sight. I kept looking back, but there was never anyone there. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I picked up the pace, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, every twist and turn leading to more of the same trees, rocks, silence. My thoughts kept going back to that journal, to the man who wrote it. Had he been imagining it all? Or was there really someone out there, hunting him? I started noticing things that made my heart pound, footprints in the dirt, fresh ones that weren't mine. They were too big, too deep. I tried to tell myself they belonged to another hiker, but I knew better. They looked just like the ones the guy in the journal had described. By the time I reached the next shelter, I was exhausted, my mind racing. There were no other hikers around this time, just me and the empty shelter. I thought about stopping, resting for a bit, but the thought of staying in one place too long made me feel sick. I decided to keep going, to push on until I reached the nearest town. I didn't care if it meant hiking through the night, I just wanted to get out of there. As I walked, the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing taller, the shadows darker. The trail, which had been so clear before, started to feel unfamiliar, like I was walking in circles. I tried to stay calm, but the panic was building in my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then I saw him. A man, standing in the middle of the trail up ahead. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but I could see that he wasn't moving. Just standing there, watching me. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, not knowing what to do. I thought about turning back, but the thought of walking through the woods in the dark, knowing he was out there, made me sick. So I stood there, staring at him, trying to figure out what to do. But before I could make a decision, he took a step toward me. That was all it took. I turned and ran, my pack bouncing on my back, my feet pounding the dirt. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, getting closer. My mind was screaming at me to go faster, but my legs were burning, my lungs ready to give out. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually, the footsteps faded. I didn't stop until I couldn't hear them anymore, until my legs gave out and I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The forest was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere. When I finally got up, I realized I had no idea where I was. The trail was gone, and I was surrounded by nothing but trees. Panic gripped me as I spun around, trying to find any sign of the trail, but there was nothing. I was lost, alone in the middle of the forest, with that man somewhere out there. I don't know how I made it out. I must have walked for hours, maybe even days. Time seemed to blur together as I stumbled through the woods, my mind racing with fear. Eventually, I found a road, and a passing car picked me up. I never went back to the trail. I still think about that journal, about the man who wrote it and what might have happened to him. I wonder if he ever made it out, or if he's still out there, lost in the woods like I was. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail in New Jersey, something I'd planned for months. It was supposed to be a few days of peace, just me and nature, nothing else. I'd heard about a shortcut that could shave off a couple of miles, and since I was feeling pretty confident, I decided to take it. The trail was well marked, but the shortcut wasn't. It was just a narrow path leading into the woods, barely visible unless you knew it was there. At first, it was fine, just like the main trail but quieter. No one else seemed to know about it, which I liked. It was just trees and the sound of my boots crunching on the ground. After about an hour, the path got narrower, and I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. But then I saw something ahead, through the trees. It was a cabin, hidden away from everything. It was small, looked old, with weathered wood and a sagging roof. There was no road or trail leading to it, just trees all around. It didn't seem like anyone had lived there for years, but I was curious. I thought maybe it was some old hunting cabin, forgotten and left behind. I walked up to it, and the closer I got, the stranger it seemed. The windows were dirty, but I could see that there were curtains, tattered and faded. The door was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. I hesitated before going in, but something pushed me to do it. Maybe it was just curiosity, or maybe it was the idea that I might find something interesting, a piece of history left behind. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The air inside was musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. There was a single room, with a small table, a chair, and a bed against the wall. The bed was unmade, the sheets yellowed with age, but what caught my attention was the wall opposite the bed. It was covered in photos, hundreds of them, pinned up in a chaotic mess. I walked closer, and that's when I realized what they were. They were all photos of hikers, people who had been on the trail. Some were old, faded, black and white, while others were more recent, in color. All the faces were the same, unsuspecting, candid shots of people just walking, sitting, or resting on the trail. Some of the photos had dates scribbled on them, but not all. I felt a chill run down my spine. The idea that someone had been taking these photos for years, watching people on the trail, was terrifying. I backed away from the wall, my heart racing, and that's when I noticed the journal on the table. It was thick, with a worn leather cover, and it looked like it had been used often. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. The pages were filled with entries, neat handwriting that detailed every single person who had been photographed. It described where they were seen, what they were doing, and even sometimes what they said. There were notes about where they camped, how long they stayed on the trail, and when they left. Some entries had been crossed out with big, angry lines, but most were left intact. I flipped through the pages, feeling sick. This wasn't just some random collection, it was meticulous, obsessive. Whoever wrote it had been doing this for years, watching people without them ever knowing. I felt like I was invading something private, something I shouldn't be seeing, but I couldn't stop. The more I read, the more disturbed I became. Then I found an entry with a date that wasn't that old. Just a few months back. It described a woman hiking alone, much like I was. It mentioned where she set up camp, how she sang to herself as she walked, and how she never seemed to notice the person following her. The last line was the worst. She never made it out. I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. I needed to get out of there. I backed toward the door, but as I turned, something caught my eye. On the floor, near the bed, was a backpack, dusty but not too old. I walked over to it and flipped it open. Inside were more photos, but these weren't of hikers on the trail. They were of a woman, the same one from the journal entry. She was in the cabin, her face filled with fear, her hands tied behind her back. I dropped the backpack and ran for the door. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed to get away from that place. I burst out of the cabin, not even bothering to close the door behind me. I ran back the way I came, the shortcut forgotten, just crashing through the trees, desperate to find the main trail again. I didn't stop until I was back on the main path, my chest heaving, sweat pouring down my face. I looked around, but there was no one. The trail was empty, just like before, but it didn't feel safe anymore. I kept moving, faster this time, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, convinced that someone was following me. I don't know how long it took, but I eventually made it to a shelter where other hikers were staying. I must have looked a mess because a few of them asked if I was okay. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain something like that? I just nodded and said I was fine, but inside, I was still shaking. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the shelter made me jump. I kept thinking about the cabin, the photos, the journal. I wondered if the person who did all of that was still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to wander off the trail like I did. In the morning, I packed up and left as fast as I could. I didn't tell anyone what I found. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back to civilization, I kept thinking about that journal entry, the one about the woman who never made it out. I wondered if anyone had ever found her or if she was still out there somewhere, just another lost hiker who never came back. When I finally made it to the trailhead, I didn't look back. I drove away, putting as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. I see shadows in the corners of my eyes, hear footsteps that aren't there. I know it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but sometimes I wonder if it's more than that. If you're ever on the Appalachian Trail, stay on the main path. Don't take shortcuts, and if you see something that doesn't feel right, just keep moving. Because out there, in those woods, you might find something you wish you hadn't. And if you do, you might not make it back. I decided to camp alone on the Appalachian Trail in Maine. I'd done it before, but this time it felt different. The air was colder, and the woods seemed quieter. I set up my tent a little off the main trail, thinking I'd get some peace. I liked the solitude. It gave me time to clear my head, away from the noise of the world. As night fell, I settled into my tent. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, but it was the usual sounds of the forest. I wasn't worried. I'd been camping enough times to know the difference between normal and something else. But then I heard it, footsteps. They were soft at first, almost like an animal, but heavier, deliberate. I froze, listening. The steps circled my tent, slow and careful. I thought maybe it was another hiker, but it was late, too late for someone to be out walking. I didn't hear any voices, just a steady crunch of leaves underfoot. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to pass, but it didn't. It stopped right outside my tent. I could hear whoever it was breathing, just standing there. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, slowly, trying not to make a sound. I unzipped the tent a fraction, just enough to peek out. The moon was bright, casting shadows through the trees. At first, I didn't see anything, just a dark outline of the woods. But then I saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 20 feet away. It wasn't moving, just staring in my direction. I couldn't make out a face, just the shape of a person, tall and thin. I shined my flashlight towards it, but the beam wasn't strong enough to reach. The figure didn't react, didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching me. I whispered a shaky hello, but got no response. The figure stayed silent, motionless. I tried to convince myself it was just another camper, but something about it didn't feel right. Why wasn't it moving? Why wasn't it saying anything? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I kept my eyes on the figure, afraid to look away. It didn't come any closer, but it didn't leave either. I considered packing up and leaving, but the idea of turning my back on it terrified me. I stayed in my tent, gripping the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me safe. The hours dragged on. I barely blinked, afraid that if I did, the figure would be gone, or worse, closer. My legs cramped from staying in the same position, but I didn't dare move. Every time I thought about getting up, my mind screamed at me to stay still. The figure just kept staring. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. It was like it was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping through the trees. I felt a small sense of relief, hoping the daylight would chase it away. But when the sun finally rose enough to see clearly, the figure was still there. I could see it more clearly now, a man, standing just inside the tree line, wearing dark clothes. He was facing my tent, his head tilted slightly, like he was curious about me. I called out again, louder this time. "Who are you? What do you want?" My voice cracked with fear. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, his head cocked to the side. The daylight made it worse somehow, seeing him so clearly and knowing he was real, not just a shadow in the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out of there. I slowly unzipped the tent, keeping my eyes on him. I grabbed my backpack, not bothering to pack anything properly. I just needed to leave. I stepped out of the tent, expecting him to do something, but he didn't move. He just watched me, like he had all night. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight in front of me like it would protect me, even though the sun was up. The man stayed at the edge of the trees, his eyes following me but his body still. I turned and started walking, trying to stay calm, but I kept glancing back, expecting him to follow. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching me leave. I didn't stop walking until I was back on the main trail, where I finally felt like I could breathe again. I looked back one last time, but the man was gone. The tree line was empty, like he'd never been there at all. But I knew what I saw. I knew he'd been there, watching me all night, for reasons I couldn't understand. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got back. I just left the trail and drove home, trying to forget. Hi everyone, my name is Stephen. I was hiking the Appalachian Trail in Virginia, something I'd done many times before. I enjoyed the quiet, the long stretches where I didn't see anyone else. This time, I was a few days in when I met him. I was taking a break, sitting on a log, eating a granola bar. He just appeared out of the trees, almost like he'd been waiting for me. He smiled, way too big, like we were old friends. He asked if he could sit, and before I could answer, he did. I didn't think much of it at first. Lots of people hike the trail. It's normal to run into someone, but this guy was different. He was overly friendly, asking me a bunch of questions: where I was from, how long I'd been hiking, where I'd planned to camp that night. His eyes never left mine, and he leaned in close when I answered, like he was trying to get inside my head. When I finished my snack, I stood up, ready to keep moving. He jumped up too, said he'd join me. I didn't know how to say no without being rude, so I just nodded, hoping he'd get tired or bored and go his own way. But he didn't. We walked together for hours. He kept up a constant stream of chatter, mostly about himself, how he'd been hiking for years, how he knew all the best spots, how he could show me shortcuts. Something about the way he talked made me uneasy. He seemed too eager, like he was trying too hard to be likable. Every time I slowed down or stopped, he'd be right there, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. I started to get this creeping feeling, like I was being trapped. I tried to steer the conversation, ask him about his plans, where he was headed, but he kept avoiding the questions, turning everything back on me. At one point, I told him I needed to find a spot to fill up my water. He said he knew a great place, just a little off the trail. I should have said no, but he insisted, and I felt cornered. We walked down this narrow path, barely visible through the brush. My stomach tightened with every step. It felt wrong, going off the trail with a stranger like this, but I didn't know how to back out. The spot he led me to was just a trickle of water, barely enough to fill a bottle. I knelt down, pretending to be focused on filling my bottle, but I could feel his eyes on me. When I looked up, he was standing too close, his smile gone, replaced by something darker, something that made my skin crawl. He asked if I needed help, his voice low and smooth, like he was offering something more than just water. I mumbled something, trying to keep calm, trying to think of an excuse to leave. He didn't move. I stood up, said I should get going before it got too late. He stepped aside, but I could feel him watching me as I walked back to the trail. My hands were shaking. I couldn't believe how fast things had changed, how quickly the situation had turned from casual to something dangerous. Back on the trail, I walked faster, hoping to lose him. But he stayed right behind me, matching my pace, his footsteps echoing mine. Every time I sped up, so did he. I could feel the tension building, like a rubber band being stretched too far. I started thinking of ways to get rid of him, but nothing seemed safe. He was bigger than me, and I was in the middle of nowhere, with no one else around. As the sun started to set, he suggested we camp together. The thought of spending the night with him made my stomach churn. I lied, said I had planned to push on for a few more miles, that I was meeting someone up ahead. His eyes narrowed, just for a second, but then he smiled again, that same wide, unsettling grin. He said he'd keep me company until then, no sense hiking alone in the dark. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let him follow me all night. I pretended to agree, walking with him for another half-mile. Then I stopped, acting like I was reconsidering, like maybe I did want to set up camp after all. I told him I needed to step off the trail for a moment, to take care of something. He offered to come with me, but I insisted I be quick. I ducked into the trees, just out of sight, and waited. I could hear him shifting his weight on the trail, pacing a little. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, to count the seconds. When I was sure he wasn't looking, I started to move, slowly at first, then faster, heading away from him, back toward the main trail, but in the opposite direction. I didn't stop. I kept moving, quiet as I could, until I was sure I was far enough away. When I finally slowed down, I realized I was shaking all over, my breath coming in short gasps. I listened, straining to hear if he was following, but all I heard was the wind in the trees, the distant call of a bird. I stayed off the main trail, circling around until I was sure he wouldn't find me. It took me hours to feel safe enough to stop. By then, it was full dark, and I was exhausted, but I didn't dare set up camp. I found a spot behind some rocks, hidden from view, and sat there, waiting for dawn. Every sound in the night made me jump, but I didn't see him again. When the first light came, I got back on the trail and didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. We had planned this hike for months. The Appalachian Trail in Vermont was supposed to be our big adventure, a break from our normal lives. Just me and Karen, my best friend since college. We were both excited, had all our gear, and had done our research. The first few days were great, perfect weather, beautiful views, and we had the trail mostly to ourselves. On the third day, we decided to split up for a bit. Karen wanted to take some pictures of a stream we passed, and I was eager to push onto a spot marked on the map, a little further up the trail. It wasn't unusual for us to hike separately for short stretches. We both enjoyed the solitude at times, so I didn't think much of it when she said she'd catch up in a few minutes. I walked ahead, feeling good, enjoying the quiet. But after about 20 minutes, I realized she hadn't caught up. I stopped, waited, but there was no sign of her. I called her name, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I started to get a bit worried, but I told myself she was probably just taking her time, maybe found something interesting to photograph. I decided to backtrack and find her. As I got closer to the stream, I started calling out to her again. Still nothing. My heart began to race a little, but I kept telling myself everything was fine. When I reached the spot where we'd separated, she was just standing there, right by the stream, staring into the water. Karen? I called out. She didn't respond, didn't even turn around. Just kept staring into the water, like she was in a trance or something. I walked up to her, and when I got closer, she finally turned to look at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, like she'd seen something horrible. What happened? I asked her, trying to keep my voice calm, but she just shook her head, her mouth slightly open like she was trying to say something but couldn't find the words. I grabbed her arm, gently, and asked again, Karen, are you okay? She pulled her arm away from me, not roughly, but with enough force to make it clear she didn't want to be touched. That's when I noticed her hands were trembling. I don't know, she finally whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. Her voice sounded shaky, not at all like herself. Let's get back on the trail, okay? I suggested, trying to get her moving. She nodded slowly but didn't say anything. As we started walking, I kept glancing over at her, waiting for her to explain what was wrong, but she stayed silent. After a while, I noticed she wasn't walking normally. Her steps were unsteady, almost like she was limping, but there wasn't anything visibly wrong with her legs. I asked her if she was hurt, but she just shook her head again, more vigorously this time, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. We kept walking, but the atmosphere had changed. The trail didn't feel as peaceful anymore. The woods felt darker, even though the sun was still out. Every little sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I tried to make small talk, hoping it would distract her or maybe distract me, but Karen didn't respond. She was walking ahead of me now, faster than before, but her movements were jerky, like she was forcing herself to keep going. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she suddenly stopped and turned to face me. Her eyes were different. There was something in them that I didn't recognize. It was like she was a stranger. "We should turn back," I said, trying to sound firm. "We need to get help." Her expression changed, almost like she was angry. "No," she said, her voice cold, so unlike the Karen I knew. "We need to keep going." I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no reason for us to keep going. We were miles from any sort of help, and the way she was acting made it clear that something was very wrong. But the look in her eyes told me that arguing with her wasn't an option. We kept walking, deeper into the woods. I could barely focus on where we were going because I was so fixated on Karen. Her behavior was getting worse, more erratic, more hostile. She'd mumble to herself, words I couldn't quite make out, but the tone was angry, almost aggressive. It scared me. At one point, she stopped again, this time so abruptly that I almost ran into her. She was staring up at the trees, her head tilted back unnaturally. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice full of fear and something else, something that sounded like hatred. I didn't know what to say. I didn't see anything, but the way she was acting made me feel like there really was something out there, something I couldn't see. I took a step back, trying to create some distance between us, but she turned around so quickly it made me jump. "You can't leave," she said, her voice low, menacing. "You have to stay." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way I was staying. Not like this. I forced myself to stay calm, tried to reason with her, but she wasn't listening. She just kept repeating that I couldn't leave, that I had to stay with her. I knew I needed to get out of there, but I didn't know how. If I just turned and ran, she might come after me. And I had no idea what she might do if she caught up to me. My mind was racing, trying to figure out a way to get away without setting her off. Then, suddenly, she turned and started walking again, faster than before, like she was on a mission. I didn't know what else to do, so I followed her, my stomach in knots. We walked for what felt like forever, deeper into the woods, until we reached a clearing. In the middle of the clearing, there was a large, flat rock. Karen walked right up to it and sat down, staring straight ahead. I stayed where I was, too afraid to get any closer. "We have to wait," she said, her voice calm now, almost serene. It was the calm that scared me the most. "Wait for what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. She didn't answer. She just kept staring ahead, as if she was waiting for something to happen, something inevitable. I knew I couldn't stay there with her, couldn't wait for whatever she was waiting for. I needed to get out, to find help, but I was terrified of what she might do if I tried to leave. I stood there, paralyzed, my mind racing. Then, out of nowhere, she started laughing. It was a horrible sound, high-pitched and unnatural, like she was losing her mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, not caring about the noise I was making, just needing to get as far away as possible. I could hear her laughter echoing behind me as I ran, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out, but I didn't stop. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. Finally, I found the trail again, though I wasn't sure how far I'd gone or where I was. I kept moving, my heart racing, until I saw other hikers up ahead. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't stop running until I reached them. I told them about Karen, about how she'd changed, but when we went back to look for her, she was gone. The rock was there, just as I'd seen it, but there was no sign of her anywhere. We searched for hours, but she was just gone. I never found out what happened to her, never understood what made her change like that. But I'll never forget the look in her eyes, the way she laughed, the way she told me I couldn't leave.